Hey everyone, it's Mattea with the Sierra Club Grand Canyon chapter, aka the Arizona chapter. I am our Grand Canyon program manager, and I'm based out of the unceded homelands of over 13 tribal nations in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I'm so excited to welcome you to Land Defenders, a podcast dedicated to the voices, stories, and wisdom rooted in the lands of the greater Grand Canyon region. Here, on land sacred to many indigenous peoples, each stone, river, mountain, and canyon wall holds stories of connection, reverence, and defense. In each episode, we challenge the forces threatening this living ecosystem and elevate the stories of those defending its future. From activists and elders to water protectors and land defenders, we're here to share the truth, confront injustice, and explore the deep-rooted connections that tie culture to conservation. Join us as we move beyond the rim and into the heart of the work to protect this region. Today you'll be hearing part one of a conversation I had with Laura Jo West, former Coconino Forest Supervisor, aka the forest supervisor who manages the peaks and subsequently Snowbowl. Don't forget to listen to part two after this. All right, off to Laura Jo. Hello, we have Laura Jo West with us today, and I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. This episode, like every episode, is one I've been really looking forward to, and Laura Jo has a very interesting background in relation to the issues on the peaks that I think y'all will not want to miss. So I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself, and then we'll go from here.
All right. Thanks, Mattea, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Laura Jo West. I was the former forest supervisor on the Coconino National Forest from 2015 until the end of July of 2022. I am a 33-year veteran of the Forest Service. I've worked all over the West in various locations with a couple of assignments in Washington, D.C. headquarters as well. And was always drawn back to this country. I was up in the Pacific Northwest before here as a forest supervisor on the Colville National Forest, which was a wonderful experience, great community. I just loved it up there. And the only place that could really tear me away from that was the Coconino when it opened up. And I think the reason for that is I was always drawn to the Colorado Plateau. I lived up in Utah for many years and spent a lot of time in southern Utah and northern Arizona, and I was always drawn to this country. I think it's magical country, sacred country, just really had a strong affinity for it. So when the opportunity came open to apply for the Coconino National Forest Supervisor position, I jumped at it and was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to serve in that capacity. Before we get too deep into this conversation, I wanted to just say a few things. I'm still pretty fresh off the Forest Service assignment, and I'm going to I'll probably use the pronoun we a lot when I talk about the Forest Service. I am not with the Forest Service anymore. I am decidedly apart from that agency now. Had a wonderful experience in the agency overall, but I still can't get past the we. I still have an affinity for the agency, and I still will probably use the term we. But I don't want that to confuse people. I am no longer the forest supervisor, and that needs to be clear. The second thing I wanted to say is that I will use the word tribes as though tribes are just one thing, and I always use that word with a bit of self-consciousness because in my work here with 13 different tribes in the area, I've really come to appreciate the incredible diversity in viewpoints, in culture, in customs, even the way they look at the peaks. They're all different. They're all very special, all very deeply knowledgeable, have strong cultural affinities for the peaks, and yet for the ease of conversation, I'm going to clump them in one group called tribes. And again, that's just for ease of conversation. But I really wanted to recognize the important differences between tribes and even among tribes, among tribal members of the same tribe and tribal governments with their members. There's just a lot of diversity in there, and something that needs to be respected and honored and listened to. But again, for ease of this conversation, I'm probably just going to use the word tribes.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Before I met you, I'd heard your name a lot, and there's a lot of incredible stories surrounding you, and you were spoken of very highly by people, which is notably earned as I've gotten to know you. Kind of as if you were the first Coconino Forest Supervisor to ever challenge Snowbowl in any way. And I'm curious what your approach was in this role. And what about the way that you did things differently than any other supervisor became so clearly threatening to them?
Well, I think that threatening part will come up throughout this conversation. I think there's a lot of things that I did that I felt I did for the right reasons, obviously, that were threatening. So I think those will reveal themselves throughout the conversation. But my overall approach was, when I came here, I wanted to make sure that the voices that were not heard in the past were heard in the future. A lot of work went in by the Forest Service, went into setting up listening sessions with the tribes back in the early 2000s when the original not the original, but one of the master development plans were being considered that included the reclaimed water for snowmaking. And the tribes participated to an incredible degree in that. There were many, many meetings, many visits with the forest supervisor, and basically none of what they offered was utilized in the final decision. And that was heartbreaking. I watched it a lot from a distance, and I thought there had to be a better way. I'm not one to really second guess my predecessors because I know this job and it's hard and it's complex and there are a lot of things and nuances that have to be taken into account. But I had to believe that there was a different way of having a relationship with tribes than what was exhibited in that earlier decision that allowed for the use of reclaimed water for snowmaking. And at the same time, I always thought of Snowbowl. Snowbowl is a contractor with the Forest Service. They hold a special use permit with the Forest Service. And what the Forest Service does is, because they cannot provide everything and because there are other folks out there who can provide for the experiences the Forest Service manages for much better than any government can, we issue special use permits to those folks. We have outfitters and guides. We have biking tours, and we have lots of different kinds of recreational special use permits that are issued by the Forest Service, and one of those is for the ski area up at Snowbowl. And so what this means is that there is a permit in which the terms and conditions are set out of how Snowbowl will operate and how the Forest Service will operate. It's a contract between the two, and the Forest Service administers this contract. So I always thought of Snowbowl as a very valuable means of supporting a recreation experience that people came here to enjoy. And the idea that standing up to Snowbowl is an interesting idea because I never really thought of it that way because I always saw them as a contractor with us. What I was trying to do was stand up for those who hadn't been stood up for in the past. And so again, it wasn't like anti-Snowbowl, it was pro, let's elevate these voices, let's bring them into the conversation in a different way than we have in the past, in a way that's more meaningful, in a way that we can demonstrate results of those conversations, in a way that we hadn't before. So that's the approach that I took. And I think I think that was very threatening overall to Snowbowl because it opening up that conversation again raised the question of whether that snowmaking would be viable in the future. If we were willing to entertain the possibility that we would end that portion of their business, that would, in their minds, end their business. So I understand. I understand their concerns with that. So it was a matter of raising, again, the voices. I didn't have a way of doing that yet. I didn't know how it was going to happen yet. In fact, we hadn't really even, we were a long way from healing the wounds of the 2005 decision. So there's a lot of trust building that still had to happen with the tribes before we ever got into a conversation with the tribes about the future management of the peaks. We were a long way from that. We were still working toward that. But again, it was threatening to Snowbowl. Snowbowl, their staff had said to me, and repeatedly over time, that the quote they used was, "They lost and we won." Wow. And that was often brought up whenever I would bring up the tribes and the significance of the issues there. They wanted to put it to bed. They felt it had been put to bed, that the courts had decided it was done. And I didn't think of it that way. And because I didn't think of it that way, I believe it was interpreted by them as that I was not showing appropriate deference to the ski area, as they're accustomed to in many other parts of the country. And I was showing an inappropriate deference to the tribes. And that is what started the that approach was very clear. I always made it clear. I was always transparent about that. Did not know how that would play out, honestly. Didn't know if it would even make any difference for Snowbowl. I just knew we had to do things in a different way and have a different conversation, and was willing to see where that led us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you were saying that in this 2005 decision, tribes were brought in a theoretically meaningful way. There was a lot of really generative meetings, it sounds like.
Yes.
But then nothing came of that. And so when you came in and you were like, actually, I want everyone to have a seat at the table and for that to mean something, that's what became very scary to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And at the same time, I didn't think I was going out on a limb with this. I thought this is the trajectory of where we were headed in this agency and working with Indigenous peoples across the country. So it didn't really occur to me, maybe that was naive, that this was groundbreaking or anything. Right?
Just doing your job.
It makes sense. And right. It seemed completely consistent with the mission of the Forest Service. And as I alluded to earlier, bringing people to the table meant first gaining some trust back after 2005. So after 2005 decision, the tribes, they sued. The Hopi sued, others sued, Navajo sued. It was very, very painful time for them, for sure. Painful, expensive, draining on every level. And I've heard many stories about this and feel confident that I can represent them by saying that. In fact, as I got here and tried to introduce myself to tribes and tried to see if I could work on what would it take to heal that, the Navajo, it took me 5 years before they would speak to me. And I can't say I blame them, but we did end up starting to speak together. And so I was very hopeful we could edge our way toward regaining some trust. And at the same time, and this is what I meant to say earlier too, is while I was trying to do that with the tribes, and my staff was working with me, the staff on the Coconino National Forest was so committed to healing this relationship. They truly were. And I was working with my counterparts at the regional office, my bosses, the regional forester, deputy regional foresters, the staff up there. I'm working across the organization to make sure they knew what we were trying to do. Again, I did not think it was groundbreaking, but it was important that we had them on board so they understood, because it was going to take a lot of work and a lot of time, and it was going to ruffle some feathers sometimes. As it did with Snowbowl, for sure. And even sometimes with the tribes, they'd get frustrated with me and so forth. It was not an easy relationship, nor did I expect it to be. But I was persistent. My staff was persistent. We had a lot of great wins around other areas unrelated to Snowbowl. There was a lot of work done across northern Arizona forests with the tribes, with youth programs, with spring restoration, with the Emery Oak Project, with Wood for Life. Wonderful, wonderful wins. that were really helping, I think, to nurture those relationships and rebuild that trust. But with Snowbowl, man, as soon as we got to Snowbowl, all bets were, the pain was deep there, and for good reason. So that subject still was very, very touchy. And again, tried to gain the support, thought I really, truly felt I had the support from the regional office to pursue that larger conversation I told you wanted to have with tribes about how we look at the peaks and how we maybe share leadership and management strategies with tribes over time. This would take a long time to get there. But felt very supported, felt like we were all on the same page with the agency about where we were headed with Snowbowl. I felt very comfortable with that, felt like I could support my staff in doing that as well, and we were working toward that goal. But that, again, to your question about the threatening, it was threatening, because that was the snowmaking issue was going to make or break Snowbowl as a business.
When you're talking about that trajectory that your guys were going, you're thinking like there was a hope for co-management, kind of like Bears Ears, or what? Mm-hmm. Okay, wow.
Yeah, I mean, this has happened in other parts of the country, and it's something I make sure I want to point out is, again, not really groundbreaking.
Yeah.
But it was for here.
Sure.
And I don't know what that was going to look like yet. And I think that the fact that you'll hear me say that a lot. I had no idea what it was going to look like. We didn't really know.
Sure.
It's not that we didn't know what we're doing. But we had a vision of how we wanted to do it together. Mm-hmm. And that was the important part. And I think the fact that I couldn't name the outcome and couldn't give a timeline on the steps was very disconcerting to many people, including even the agency. That never bothered me. This was a for life, forever kind of a process and a project and an endeavor, and required love and commitment and perseverance and all the things. And so it didn't occur to me to be concerned about a specific outcome, or because maybe the tribes aren't all necessarily well resourced enough to participate or interested in a co-management strategy.
Sure.
That wasn't a given. Yeah. But we were going to explore that. Yeah. We were going to see if maybe that was what an outcome would look like. But I had no preconceived notions of what that outcome would look like. I just wanted to make sure the right people were around the table talking about what it could be.
Do you know if there's continual discussion or movement towards that now?
I heard that in conjunction with the MOA, there's a separate committee that was established to talk about maybe how things were going to happen long term. And I don't know, I honestly can't tell you where that committee is or if anything has moved forward with that. But it involved tribal members and the Forest Service. Yeah. Just haven't heard anything on that.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I hope it's still there, and I hope it has some energy. Right now, as a slight aside to this conversation, the Forest Service is, like all federal agencies right now under the current administration, is really struggling with staffing and with a lot of unknowns about how they're going to be organized, what their priorities are going to be, what sort of resources they'll have to do the job and complete the mission and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stressors put on the agency right now. So it would not surprise me if things are stalled out a little bit while they put their emphasis where they can, just to get by right now. So
yeah. Well, I hope that they continue dreaming. I think it's really it's beautiful to hear how you thought about things and the comfort you had with the unknown, because that's how we build these new worlds and these new things that we want to see in the world. And even if they take generations to come to life, like that's okay. That's how the world works. And I think that can be really threatening to some of the way that our agencies and systems are set up when things are tied to timelines and outcomes and budgets, etc., where it's like, well, if we can't if we can't see this happening, then we can't actually do it.
And certainly businesses need some sort of certainty too.
Sure.
But it's interesting that you mentioned the budgets and the timelines and whatnot. I don't mean it to sound, I hear myself when I talk about my vision of having that coalition of tribes to talk about management of the peaks as though it's some kind of nebulous thing. It sounds idealistic, frankly. But that's not how I pictured it. I pictured it was going to be a lot of work. I mean, it was an ideal in my mind. However, I also am smart enough to recognize it's going to take making sure people have a way to get to the table, that they're resourced enough to do that, that we have a agreement on how we would engage together, that we have a structure, that we have a charter, that we have our own little timelines and many objectives and approaches that we want to take, goals. How will we deal with conflicts when they arise? How will we adjust our vision in the future as life changes and things like that? So there's a lot of structure and those sorts of things that you talked about, the logistics of it, that still had to occur. I mean, it wasn't going to happen by magic.
Yeah.
There was a lot of work to do, and I was down for it for sure, and my staff was, but we didn't get a chance to get there. So at least not yet.
Yeah.
Still hopeful.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll see over the next 4 years if they, I hope they have the capacity to continue that.
Yeah, that would be
work.
That'd be great.
Okay. Well, now I feel like we have a bit of a foundation of your background and your approach to things in this position. So I'd like to backtrack a little bit to explore. So you became the supervisor in 2015. And I would love to talk about some of the major events that went down during your 7 years in that position, and what it was like to work with Snowbowl and their parent company, Mountain Capital Partners.
Yeah. So, again, Snowbowl was right in the front of my mind when I started this job, because it's, it was a worldwide issue at the time. So I was always very keenly aware of its presence and what it meant to the community and to the Indigenous people here. So I arrived in 2015, and it was about the same time that Mountain Capital Partners purchased Snowbowl. And so we were all new to this. And when I first got here and Snowbowl, Mountain Capital Partners, became the new owners, sat down with them very early on in that period. And we had just a conversation. They talked about what their plans were and who they were about. And it was great, to meet them and to learn what they had hoped for the ski area. It's always good to meet with your your permittees like that. So in that meeting, I distinctly remember that meeting like it was yesterday. I remember looking at them, and they're not from here. I don't know how familiar they were with the issues. In fact, I was a little bit stunned. By the end of that conversation, I was like, has anybody talked to you about what went down here in 2005? Seemed a little they seemed a little taken aback by what I brought up. But what I brought up to them in that conversation was, and again, this was in the interest of building a relationship with them that was workable and, a business relationship. That was how I looked at it. I let them know that, this is going to be a tough place for you to operate. This is not an easy place. This is complex. Nothing is going to be easy for you here. Processes are going to take longer than you think. There's going to be more hurdles to proposals you have than what you're probably used to, because I've worked with ski areas in the past, and generally it's a done deal. You have a ski area, you just allow things, you just allow it to happen because it's, you want them to benefit, you want the skiers to benefit and the visitors, and it's all good. There aren't a lot of conflicts, But this place was different. It says you're operating on a sacred mountain. There's a history here. Anything new, everything's going to be put under a microscope. And it's just going to be challenging for you. And they didn't seem to really understand that. And that was the first time I heard we won, they lost. That I basically hinting that I needed to get over it and get past it and get on board with the ski area. And I wasn't not on board with the ski area. I just thought they should know that I thought I was helping them develop their business strategy. Like, understand that this needs to be part of your business strategy as you move forward here with whatever you want to propose for improvements or whatever on Snowbowl. This will be an underlying theme and that I carry with me that is real, that exists, and that will also provide a lens through which I will look when I'm looking at what this ski area is to become in the future. I'll be looking through this lens of what this mountain means to so many people. And that was the first time that I think I laid that out, and I think that they had some concerns about whether I was going to be a strong enough advocate for them. And again, my intention there was only to make sure that they understood the environment they were working in. Yeah. So after that, let's see, 2015. So by then the infrastructure was in place and the snowmaking was happening. And what else was happening after that is that now that the snowmaking was on board, the owners felt they could invest properly in the other improvements that were authorized in the 2005 decision. A lot of people think that was just about snowmaking, and it wasn't. It was a whole master development plan. Snowmaking just sort of took over as the main issue because it was, really important. But there were a lot of other improvements, lodge expansions, new ski lifts, just a whole host of things. And now that the infrastructure was in and snowmaking was happening, Snowbowl came in and started wanting to implement those decisions. And I was obligated, by law to make sure that they could do that. So they came with their proposals, and I authorized each one as they came in. These are the proposals to implement some of the other projects. But as time passed, as the years passed, I got increasingly nervous about doing this because so much time has passed. I would get people saying, why are you allowing Snowbowl to do this, such and such, this project without public input? And I'd say, well, because this was a decision that was authorized in 2005. So a lot of people have gone since then, and new people have come. And it did give the appearance that we were just willy-nilly just letting, Snowbowl or the Forest Service, build stuff up there. So I increasingly got concerned about that and really wanted to make sure that we were much more transparent and let people know up front that here's what we're planning to do and here's why. So we really got on that and got clear about that. Now, as part of that 2005 decision, let me back up to that. Because the 2005 decision resulted in an impact to the tribes that was considered adverse in legal terms, clearly it was adverse, the Forest Service was required under the National Historic Preservation Act to develop a memorandum of agreement that laid out because this was an adverse impact on the tribes, what sorts of mitigating activities could they participate in or promote that would help offset that adverse impact. The tribes weren't interested at that point too much in coming to the table. 4 tribes did sign that agreement. There was a few mitigating activities that were part of that MOA. Again, most tribes said if you're going to do snowmaking, we're not even going to participate in this. So that happened as part of the MOA in 2015 at the same time 2005 at the same time that the decision was made to approve the master development plan at the time. Well, in 2015, before I got there, the MOA apparently expired. If you read the original MOA, I read it it can be read a couple different ways, but I won't go into that. But it did expire in 2015, in February of 2015. I got there in August or late July, something like that. And we just continued going on because I knew we were still fulfilling the parts that we agreed to. We were still trying to fulfill. Did not realize at the time that the expiration meant stop everything. You need a new MOA. And that was brought to our attention in a way we hadn't considered it before by the Wallapai tribe in May of 2021. So in May of 2021, it was brought to our attention that the MOA has expired. I said, well, yeah, but there's different ways to kind of look at that. And I said, but while we figure that out, I wrote to Snowbowl and says, well, you need to stop all your construction work on the projects that you still have under the original decision until we figure this out. And so they did, and immediately contacted their lawyers. And as soon as their lawyers got involved, then our lawyers got involved. And so it took months to resolve this. They were pretty angry it had expired, that we had not renewed, and that they had to stop their projects. And at the time, the project they really wanted to finish was to extend the snowmaking further up the mountain. This was approved in 2005. They hadn't finished it yet. They had about 3,000 feet still to go. So that all got stopped. And the MOA, was dormant at that point, and nothing else could continue. So several months later, the attorneys finally came to agreement that, yes, it has expired. No activities can continue until a new MOA is in place. So if you want to do that, start with a new MOA. Backing up a little bit from the MOA, because that happened in 2021, there are a couple other things that happened with Snowbowl in 2020 or 2021. Again, I don't have the year. We received a master development plan, I think it was 2020, for Snowbowl for their next iteration of proposed development. And this is required by the ski area under the terms and conditions of their permit, that they submit every 10 years or so a proposal for future development. And in that proposal, there were tons of things, anything you would want on a ski area, and more. A lot of summer activities, alpine slides and mountain coasters and zip lines, and then winter
venue.
activity, all sorts of things. Downhill biking trails, new lodges up high, things like that, all sorts of things. So that was not a surprise that we would get something like that. But before, and what they do is they submit that, and then there's an exercise where the Forest Service is supposed to accept it. It doesn't mean that they approve it. They just say, yes, we accept it. Before I was willing to accept it, I asked Snowbowl, knowing where we had been in the past with these things, and they were recommending some things that had been fought over in the past, like night skiing, more snowmaking, some things that I just shook my head and think, wow, why would you want to go through this again? Why would any of us want to go through that again? That was not a good scene. So I asked them, please take this and take it out into the public. You have a role in this. This is your ski area. Take it out and see what people think. Let's see what's happened since 2005. Go to all the tribes. I asked them to go all the tribes, go to businesses, go to elected officials, share this, get people's thoughts, and make any adjustments to your plan based on what you hear. And what they did is they did do that. They took it out to the communities, to the chambers, to the elected officials, to the tribes, and gave presentations about what was in the proposal. And then when it came back to me, there was not a single thing that was different. And I should have known that would happen. I honestly, I can't really speak for them, and I apologize in advance if this isn't true, but it almost felt like they thought that wasn't their job. And I was hopeful that we would just sort of all be together in this and how we would work with tribes in the future. So I had hoped that they could, kind of foster some different relationships that would involve some meaningful changes in their plans. That did not happen. So I went ahead and accepted a version of their master development plan, but I told them that I'm taking out the things that have been fought over in the past. No more snowmaking than what you have authorized currently, and no night skiing, because that was also fought over in the past. And there were a couple other minor things, but I asked them to take those out. And then I accepted it. And in my acceptance letter, I said, before we move this into a NEPA process where we evaluate this proposal, any proposed action that we move forward with, proposed action is what launches the NEPA process and public involvement and all of that. It's an articulation of what they want to do. That proposed action has to be done in concert with the tribes so that we don't go down this same path where the Forest Service lays down this big honkin' project and development, and then we go through the same battle and ask the tribes to make their case again. No, we're not doing that again. We're not doing that again. It didn't make sense. It was disrespectful, and we know better than that. So let's do better now that we know better. And so what I wanted to do is make sure that again, before we started that process, we worked with the tribes to say what is acceptable, what can we propose to move forward with, and then we would have alternatives to that, and they might be more, in keeping with what the ski area wanted, MCP wanted, but that was all articulated in the transmittal letter to them when I accepted their proposal. Didn't hear anything from them on that, but I'm pretty sure that didn't make them very happy either. That proposal has been sitting on a shelf ever since. So I don't know what's going to happen with that, whether they will resurrect that. I'm sure they're kind of waiting for me to leave before they did that. But I'm not, again, sure where that is in the process and whether that transmittal letter will be honored. But so those are the major things that really happened in terms of interactions with Snowbowl over the years that really fostered a certain kind of relationship with them. I will say, in following up on what I started on the MOA, I talked about how it halted a lot of the projects that were still needed to be completed under the 2005 decision. This started the discussion on the MOA started a really interesting cascade of events. When we finally agreed a new MOA was needed in order for the MCP to continue building their projects, my boss asked me to develop different strategies, how we could go about that. I said, I understand that's what's needed, but I think also now that everything is stopped, let's use this opportunity as an opportunity to open up that bigger conversation and see if now we can bring people to the table and then do the MOA within that context. Maybe come up with a strategy of how we're going to look at the mountain and get their agreement, and if they want to go forward with an MOA, for whatever reason right now, we do that. But to just do an MOA seemed insulting to me, to the tribes, because what it was essentially was a permission slip. It was, here, would you please agree to these things, sign off so that Snowbowl can continue to build the things that you didn't want them to build in the first place, right? It just was not sitting well with me, especially as my staff and I had worked so hard over the years to develop this relationship, had been promising a different future of how we would be interacting. And this seemed like 10 steps backwards. It seemed completely out of integrity with the way we were going to approach it, unless we did the MOA in the context of that larger conversation. So my boss instructed me to go ahead and come up with a timeline of what it would take just to do the MOA. And we came up with a timeline that, and there's certain parts of this timeline that are prescribed in the National Historic Preservation Act. There are certain timelines of which you allow the tribes 30 days to respond to this or that or whatever. So there are certain prescriptive timelines. But we knew from experience with the tribes here that gee, lo and behold, the tribes have other things to do than focus on Snowbowl. Imagine that. And so we were very sensitive to the fact that not tribal governments and tribal councils don't meet on a regular basis. Sometimes it's every 2 months, sometimes it's monthly, whatever. Sometimes there are ceremonial periods where they won't meet or they don't want to talk about this. There's just working with the tribes and having conversations and in a meaningful way involved working within that context of what their culture prescribes for them. And we were sensitive to that and wanted to honor that. So we came up with a timeline based on our experience that, we might be able to get it done in 2 years, a new MOA. The Mountain Capital Partners hired their own archaeologist who helped build a time frame, and it came out to be about 6 months. And if you actually followed the script, it would be 6 months. It would be exactly 6 months, but that's just not how things work in the real world. And so I argued, no, that's just unrealistic. This is just shoving it down their throats. We're not going to get anything out of this, and we're going to go way backwards in a lot of other ways. So what happened there was I was frankly accused of trying to stall the process and showing it, again, an inappropriate deference to the tribes because I was willing to work around their schedules and their events. And this was the last straw, I think, for Mountain Capital Partners. And they went directly to the chief at that point. They talked to my boss as well, but they went direct. They realized they weren't going to get me off this two-year thing. I wasn't budging on that. It was going to be at least that. And so they went and brought up a list of things, allegations of things I had said and done or whatever that demonstrated I was not on board with the ski area and asked for me to be removed from my job. And so those were conversations. They had several conversations, I think, with the chief and deputy chief of the U.S. Forest Service and with my boss. I was not privy to any of those conversations. I heard secondhand about many of them, but was not part of those. So I don't know what the allegations were, nor was I given the opportunity to respond to any of them. But I wasn't really worried. I mean, you do hard things in this job, and sometimes you ruffle some feathers, and I try to work with a sense of integrity and transparency always. So I felt pretty good, even though I knew I was upsetting them. I felt good about the approach. Felt like it was going to be a win-win in the end for all, and that we could make this work. Was not at all concerned. Felt like I had, and my staff and I had built up a lot of rapport and support in the agency for the approach we wanted to take. So I was very surprised when, after those conversations that the ski industry had with the chief, I was removed from all things related to Snowbowl. I was able to keep my job. My boss had no intention of firing me, to her credit. But I was removed from interacting on anything to do with Snowbowl, which was a blow to me and my staff both, because those relationships, when you're building relationships, those are personal, They're professional, but they're personal. You invest a lot in that. And with any human relationship, it's about human. I mean, I was in it for the long haul. I was going to be in it till we got some really good traction on this. And so I was really surprised that I was taken off that. And the work with Snowbowl was assigned to one of my peers, who was a forest supervisor on the Cibola National Forest, Steve Hottenbach, who was a former attorney. And so he took over these conversations about the memorandum of agreement, and started working with tribes to develop a new MOA. And so he did that, and I was asked to support that effort. So my staff and I were both asked to support that effort. So I had some feelings about that. I tried for months to kind of continue to share the story of what this could be in the future if we did things just a little bit differently. Did not gain traction with that at that point, and decided it was time for me to leave the agency. So there we have it.
I'm like, oh man, there's so many different avenues I could go from here. Because, I mean, we could expand upon the fact that, because I don't think you said that none of the tribes signed on to the new
None
MOA.
of the tribes signed on to it, right? They all participated. And here's what I want to say about this. So the tribes sat down, and by the way, a little snarkiness here, forgive me, but it took about 2.5 years ultimately to get this done. Just saying. But anyway, it was a process that everyone was committed to, and Steve did a good job. Steve and I are friends, but we're very, very different in our approaches. And so he approached it. It worked out in terms of they came up with a lot of items to fill this memorandum of agreement. But in the end, as you mentioned, none of the tribes signed it. And I think your prior podcasts have spoken about this, but this had to do with the fact there was no monitoring requirements included in there, which is what they really wanted. But I don't think all was lost. I got some interesting feedback from some tribal members who said that they found value in the fact they had to sit together and learn how to work with each other, which is something I was always hoping we could have the opportunity to do, is have tribes be talking to each other. Because like I said at the very, very beginning of this podcast, they are all so wildly different and see things differently and want different things. And that's great. But instead of all of them individually telling me, that's not as helpful as if they can all talk with each other, find their common ground, to the degree possible with one voice, speak to the federal government about here is what we want. So anyway, those conversations that they had to have amongst themselves as part of this MOA process turned out to be really valuable for them. Mm-hmm. And I think they learned a lot just for themselves about how to work together and how we might do things in the future. So I was really heartened by that. I think that was a good outcome of the process, even if the MOA itself was, didn't get the signatures. And it's interesting. The National Historic Preservation Act does not require signatures of the tribes. It only requires the Forest Service, the National Historic Preservation Office, and the State Historic Preservation Office to sign off on it. Now, interestingly, I thought this was interesting. I don't know anyone else thinks this is odd, but I thought it was odd. Snowbowl is a signatory on this. And the reason I think that's odd is because Snowbowl, again, is a contractor with the Forest Service, and they basically work for the Forest Service. So to see them elevated, and again, I'm not trying to bash Snowbowl. I mean, they're looking after their best interests. I understand that. All of that is rational. But to see that all on display in that memorandum of agreement where the tribes are really the ones we're having the conversation with. That was the whole point of this. The adverse effect was on the tribes. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that should be elevated to signatory status and either sign off or choose not to sign off, not Snowbowl. And so it was always strange to me that the Forest Service invited Snowbowl to be a signatory on that. But there were some parts of that memorandum of agreement that did require a commitment of Snowbowl to come up with some money and support the tribes financially in certain ways. So maybe that's why, but it seemed odd to me.
Yeah, and if you haven't listened to prior podcast episodes, quite a few of them talk more in depth on this if you're interested in learning more. Wow. What quite the 7 years that you had.
It was and that was just the snowball part
right,
of it.
Yeah.
Obviously a
so
lot
much
more to the job.
Absolutely.
It was, I have to tell you, it was the dream job. Mm-hmm. It was the best job of my life.
Wow.
Absolutely. I have no regrets about the job itself, the people I worked with, the community, the tribes, all of it. It was the best experience ever.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that. And at the same time, it's, what's the word? It's really frustrating and devastating in the way that it went down. Because what I'm hearing is that Mountain Capital Partners and Snowbowl and these ski lobby groups literally worked very hard to get you removed, despite you doing a really good job in this role and doing your job the way it was supposed to be done. And it sounds like, I don't know. It sounds like there was a lot happening behind closed doors in order to make this happen and to bring someone else in that was going to be a lot more favorable to what they wanted to happen. Thank you for joining us today in our conversation with Laura Jo West. To learn more and stay connected, follow us on social media at Protect Grand Canyon, listed in the show notes, and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And please consider sharing these episodes with others. We have had great success in sharing this podcast out into the world just by word of mouth, so please don't stop. And thank you to each one of you that has done that. Every episode and story shared is just another step towards protecting these sacred places for generations to come. For questions or to get involved locally, don't hesitate to email me at mattea.goetz@sierraclub.org, also listed in the show notes. And a big thank you and shout out again to our incredible partners at Beyond FLG. You can find them on all the platforms at Beyond FLG, and I really do want to emphasize a thank you to them. They've been really instrumental in supporting this podcast and are an incredible group of humans doing really good work in the Flagstaff community, and they have a whole family of podcasts, so be sure to check those out as well. Until next time, may you find a deeper connection to the land and the wild places around you.